I'm Brice Futch.
And I'm Tony Melton.
And this is The Way Forward. Welcome to today's episode of The Way Forward podcast. I'm Brice Futch.
And I'm Tony Melton.
And today we are really excited for this podcast. We have a number of really great guests, and we're going to be talking about China again, as this season is all about China. We're going to talk about religious freedom and persecution in China, why that religious freedom in China is important to us here in the States, why China is moving in that direction, their goal for security, et cetera. And then what are some things that we can be doing to fight that religious freedom and make a change there in China. So I'm going to start by introducing our guests. First, we have Logan Carmichael. Logan, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and what it is you do?
Yeah, happy to. So my name is Logan. Don't be deceived by the name. I am a woman, and I am the advocacy director for China Aid Association. And we are a Christian group that works on religious freedom and rule of law for all in China. But before that, I'm from Midland, Texas. So
nice.
from the heartland of the Bible Belt. We love it. But I currently live in Washington, D.C., working for them out here.
That's wonderful. Well, Logan, appreciate that. Next is John Stonestreet from the Colson Center. John, tell us a little bit about what you do and how you got there.
Oh, man, that's such a long story. I think that's way more than anybody could possibly be interested in. But I run an organization called the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. If that name Chuck Colson rings a bell from a generation past, it's really a guy that really was passionate about helping the church be the church in culture, helping them understand what's happening, the big shifts that were taking place in culture and how to respond from a Christian worldview. So you might remember the Breakpoint radio program, and that now is a podcast and an email and a radio program that goes out every single day on something having to do with culture and worldview. So, the topic today of China is something that we've been looking at for a long time, since we deal with issues of international religious persecution, international religious freedom, and things like that. And right now, if you're having a conversation about international religious freedom, you're either talking about China or Nigeria, I think. By and large. So anyway, that's what I do. I live in Colorado Springs. I'm married to Sarah, 4 kids. My social security number is. That's probably all you need to know.
No, that's good. Yeah, and Breakpoint has been a great resource for us as we've been studying this as well. That's really where the Uyghurs was where I first heard about the Uyghurs and what was going on in China specifically with them. John and I met originally through the Colson Fellows program, which is a 9-month deep dive into apologetics. And something that I would highly recommend to you. Now, Peter, last but not least, tell us a little about you and what you do.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Brice. So I do international religious freedom work, worked at the State Department for International Religious Freedom Ambassador Sam Brownback. Before I was with him, I did work for Middle Eastern Christian communities, advocating for them in Washington after ISIS. That work now has led into just continued work in this issue, trying to develop an international movement around the issues of international religious freedom and counter persecution, and really, as John said, if you're talking about international religious freedom right now and you're not talking about China, you're missing the big picture.
That's really good. John, why don't you start and tell us about, so this podcast is while we are talking about big issues, it really is for the benefit of local folks here in North Georgia. And we're still a very Christian area. We're in the heart of the Bible Belt. Tell us about why Christians, specifically here in North Georgia, should care about religious freedom in China, especially religious freedom for somebody who believes totally different than we do. Why should we care about that for Muslims?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that is the challenge here, is that we're talking specifically about a Muslim population that has that is being treated at such a despicable scale that it has earned kind of the official definition, which is a really careful definition. A lot of people don't realize that the term genocide has actually been very carefully defined, and rightfully so. It's not just a word you throw around just because there's an ethnic conflict or even because there's a religious conflict. It has to meet a particular scale, a particular degree of oppression, of death, of abuse, an attempt to eliminate the population. And this has earned that. Look, a Christian frame of reference begins with the doctrine of creation. And part of that doctrine of creation, a critical chapter in that story is that every single person is made in the image and likeness of God. So our value is not earned. Our value is not associated with ethnic belonging or our being able to accomplish a set of criteria, either as individuals or as a people group. Our value is intrinsic. It's inherent to who we are. So that should be enough to care and at least pray. The other part about it is that one of the great kind of systemic conflicts between in world history has been between the religious and the non-religious. And so this is the example of that. Now, there certainly has been a whole history of conflict within religious groups or between groups that we would call religious groups, because of, either competing ideas of who God is or competing ideas even within a particular religion. We see this in Islam, for example, in the Middle East. We see this in the history of Christianity. But the big story of the 20th century was, the rise of secular militancy through fascism, Nazism, and ultimately communism. And there's something about a secular frame of reference, because it doesn't have an ability to identify human value intrinsic to the human person, to an individual person, then it's easy to divide the world up between good guys and bad guys. Right. This was Solzhenitsyn's critique of communism from the very beginning, and one that he reiterated as he spoke out against the evils of the Soviet Union. He said, if only there was this bad group of bad people that we could set apart and then eliminate, and then that would take care of all the problems. And that's really the way that communism sees things, is that, there's a group of people that are guilty by means of being part of a group of people. And by the way, that might sound like some other ideologies that have become, recently popular in the American context as well. But the larger point here is that that's not how Christians think. We don't think that certain people are good guys and certain people are bad guys because of who they belong to. Solzhenitsyn summed up the problem with that theory by stating that famous line, that the line between good and evil runs right through the middle of every human heart, not between people groups, not between nation states, but right down the middle of the human heart. And so that's what we know is true. And because we know it's true, then we should stand up for it. For those who are the victims of these bad ideas. But there's also something about defending religious freedom itself. Religious freedom is not just a freedom. Religious freedom is a freedom on which most other, if not all other freedoms hinge. It's hard to have full economic freedom if you don't have freedom of religion. Right. It's hard to have freedom of speech if there's not something that you can be allegiant to higher than the state or other than the state. And religious freedom secures all of those other freedoms. So if we want to see the gospel go forward, then we should have a vested interest in making sure that these sorts of freedoms are preserved, because it's good for people. It respects their dignity. And it's the way that societies best function together. I mean, honestly, the best thing for the Chinese Communist Party members would be religious freedom, because religious freedom itself is an intrinsic good based on who we are as human people.
No, that's very true. And that harkens back to, and y'all don't know this, but our last episode we recorded with Adam McLeod from Faulkner, and we talked about those core human rights. And this is a major piece of this. This is where it all comes from, right? It all stems from that sovereign. So, Logan, tell us a little bit about what's going on specifically with the Uyghurs right now. Where are they at? What's the state of that persecution look like?
Yeah, I feel like first I kind of want to draw back and talk about how we got to where we are today. That since President Xi Jinping became president in 2013, that he has streamlined and accelerated the systematic persecution of all religious minority groups in China. Because to President Xi, the idyllic China is one where the Chinese Communist Party is first, not your family, not your ethnicity, not your culture, or your religion. So the Uyghur people are a threat to this idyllic China that she's trying to create. But really, this began in about 2016 when the former party secretary of the Tibet Autonomous Region, Chen Guangguo, was moved to Xinjiang, which is a far western region of China, where about half the population are the ethnic minority group Uyghurs. Here, he was able to implement the same silencing and increased policing that he used against the Tibetan Buddhists, but in an accelerated manner. So he created essentially a police surveillance state where he was able to monitor and control the 12 or so million Uyghurs in that region. And they did this through facial recognition cameras on every street, mosque, and a lot of the residential home buildings, requiring apps on phones to monitor for content that was deemed suspicious by the government. Kashgar and other regions of Xinjiang, even in recent years, have been systematically collecting DNA, fingerprints, blood, iris scans, voice recordings, and head portraits of Uyghur residents. So all of this, oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, and they also, isn't there also a program where they had members of either the Communist Party or the military living with Uyghur families?
They would have them come and stay in order to monitor what is going on inside the homes. Just an insane amount of control in people's everyday lives. And so all of that information is being collected and sorted in order to decide who needs to be sent to these so-called re-education camps. And the reality of these camps is not education, but instead an unjust, unfounded imprisonment of minorities on the basis of anti-terrorism. So Chen Guangguo was able to build and oversee this police state re-education camp system. So his persecution was kind of honed in Tibet and then recreated in Xinjiang. Since 2017, researchers have identified 380 new prison sites in Xinjiang using satellite imagery. And this is where they believe 1 to 3 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic minorities have been or are currently being incarcerated. So the goal of these camps is basically indoctrination to transform them into citizens who would never challenge the ruling Communist Party. But again, it's ironic to call it re-education because it's many scholars and academics, professionals who are fluent in Mandarin, who may have even been Communist Party members, have been arrested because they are Uyghur or because they are Muslim.
What percentage of the population does that equal to, the 1 to 3 million that are in the camps? Is that what percentage of the Uyghur population is that?
That's probably about a third on the higher end of the spectrum. There's about 12 million Uyghurs probably in the Xinjiang region, which is in recent years about half of the total population of Xinjiang. And a lot of people think that there's been a ton of Han people moving in. Han is the ethnic majority of China, moving into Xinjiang to kind of try to dilute the Uyghur population there. So probably about a third of Uyghur Muslims is the upper cusp of that number. But in a lot of the leaked documents from the Chinese Communist Party, reasons that Uyghurs were justified in being sent to these camps varied from having too many children, having family and connections outside of China, owning a Quran in the house, having a beard, whatever they kind of label as suspicious activity. So these like everyday, ordinary, peaceful religious practices, such as prayer, became reasons for internment. Officials have targeted religious leaders in sacred places such as Muslim cemeteries and mosques in an attempt to break down those cultural traditions of the group. But when we look at the camps themselves, we really only know what's going on inside of them because of former detainees who have somehow been released and who have been brave enough to speak out. Because unfortunately, foreigners and journalists and government officials have been barred from visiting the region. But the pictures that these survivors paint of the high security facilities is of rampant and systematic mental, physical, and sexual abuse. Torture and beatings are common, intermixed between the propaganda trainings that they sit through. And horrifically, as John said, it has been labeled a genocide, but it was heightened beyond a cultural genocide because of the mass sterilization of women detainees who are being forcibly given IUDs and are being given unknown medication that stops menstruation even after they've left the camp. So that is one of the requirements to be called a genocide, is to do that population control to try to stop women from being able to have children. Really one of the most heart-wrenching stories to come out of the camps just this past year is women are now speaking out about the systematic rape of the women by the guards in the camp. And there's quite a few women that have spoken out and shared their stories and experiences. But one story that, could make you lose sleep is apparently some of the guards had brought out all the detainees into a courtyard and grabbed one of the Uyghur women and raped her in front of all the other detainees and forced the other women to watch. And if any of them reacted, cried, tried to look away, they were then removed and taken away for punishment. So just the crimes against humanity and beyond inhumane treatment of these people for really basic reasons, for trying to live their lives, should be raising alarm bells with everyone across the world. But sure. Really, one of the last aspects I want to draw from the surveillance state to kind of the re-education camps, there's also this kind of new third realm that they've found, is that this new level is the Chinese government has found a way to monetize this genocide. So evidence indicates that graduating detainees from this re-education system have been sent directly to factories to work across regions of China. So this system, from surveillance to re-education to forced labor, means that China can achieve this indoctrination and turn a profit off of it. Because China is the largest cotton producer in the world, and 80% of China's cotton comes from the Xinjiang region. So this means that every clothing item that says made in China is highly, highly likely to be complicit with the Uyghur slave labor.
That's insane. It's just absolutely incredible and horrendous. Peter, tell us a little bit. You've kind of been on the forefront of the policy side of things for a while. Tell us, what are some things the State Department has done in the past, is looking to do to kind of push back on this and expand this religious freedom and basically stop what's going on there?
Well, sadly, there isn't. I would say, first of all, it's not enough. But a lot of work was done and is being done. The Trump administration gave a lot of leash to the International Religious Freedom Office in State Department, and that office had been created, but it was nascent, and it wasn't really until Ambassador Brownback, Secretary Pompeo, and really Vice President Pence, all sort of with the blessing of President Trump, really put energy into this effort that office sort of came into its own, I would say, and really got what became sort of a seat at the big kids table. Before then, it had really been almost sort of like a second tier issue that we would get to if we had time when we dealt with the adult issues. So it really came into its own. And an example of that and the work that was done by the IRF office and by the Global Criminal Justice Office was the recognition of genocide that is going on. That is, as John correctly pointed out, that is a legal definition there that was are meticulously researched and poured over and considered and debated internally. It was not sort of a haphazard political decision. And we had to do that at the State Department because there's a credibility argument going on in the international community right now between the U.S. and China. And so when the U.S. comes out and says China is committing a genocide, a lot of countries are then looking to see what China says. And China says, no, we're not. This is a lie from the U.S. It's politically motivated. They're threatened by our rising economic power. Right. And so there's this major credibility debate that's going on. And I have, friends from other countries who, when I talk to them and I raise the issue of Uyghurs, especially with Muslims from the Middle East, they're skeptical. They say, what proof do you have? And thankfully, we have a huge amount of proof now from survivors, from satellite imagery, and even from Chinese government documents stating what they're doing. They're not shy. They say this in their own documents, right? So there's a huge body of evidence. It was important to sort of put a flag in the ground and say a genocide is being committed. This is not acceptable. Now, okay, so where do you go from there? the sanctions have been placed on the entities committing these atrocities, the government funded and government adjacent entities to the CCP committing these atrocities. It's never enough, right? And as the sort of in the big picture, how do you get China to stop doing this? Well, you have to make it more painful for them to engage in this bad behavior than it is beneficial, right? So we have to increase, I think, pain on a whole host of subjects. Now, what is the U.S. has taken some smart steps, just sort of in the geostrategic posturing, the formation of the Quad, Secretary Pompeo sort of launching the Quad, which is continuing on in the Biden administration, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the United States working together for stability in the region and partnership. And then there's also the AUKUS, AUKUS, I guess how it would be said, but that is the US, Australia, and the UK coming together to collaborate. That was newly announced by Biden recently, and that's a smart move. Things like that are important on a big scale. But then I sort of have a laundry list of things that I would like to see happening more sort of on a smaller scale that are important as well. And these are things that I think maybe for your listeners may be of interest. Logan rightly pointed out that supply chains are entangled in this. And, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute put out this really phenomenal study where they basically said they listed 82 well-known global brands in technology, clothing, and automotive. So we're talking Apple, BMW, Nike, Samsung, that likely their research suggests that those brands likely source supply chains that go back to sort of products that are produced by Uyghur forced labor. This is slave labor, enslaved Uyghur Muslims producing these products in this supply chain, right? And so that is really troubling. And as of yet, a good response to that has not been developed. I'm working with a number of groups that are trying to sort of sort out how do we clearly sort of delineate so people who don't want to participate through the jeans that they're wearing or the phone that they're buying in supporting forced, religiously identified slave labor and genocide. And so that's one element is going to be sort of sorting out how we handle supply chains, how we make decisions in our purchasing and encourage companies not to participate in supply chains that tie back to forced labor and really, especially religious persecution associated with forced labor. And really a lot of these companies often don't even know because supply chains have 3 and 4 layers deep. And a lot of companies aren't asking tough questions of their suppliers. Another great example is the Mulan movie, right? This is one that's close to home for people, right? Disney making a movie in which they thanked they produced this film next to company or these government entities that are basically committing genocide, right? Unacceptable. And thankfully there was a lot of outcry and Disney sort of financially and publicly suffered for that action. More of that should be done. I'm really, I don't know if you guys have seen this NBA player, Enes Kanter, who's been very vocal. Yeah. And it's in harsh contrast to what we saw James Harden when he apologized to the CCP, sort of saying, "Oh, we're so sorry." When the Rockets manager said he supported the people of Hong Kong, and James Harden came and said, "We're so sorry, we've hurt your feelings." What a terrible thing. So we're seeing this really. So people should support this NBA player. Share his story on Facebook. Share his messages on Twitter. Those are low hanging fruit. Don't watch Mulan. Share these things. Like support these attempts. Then sort of on a bigger level, what are some things that can be done? I want to see more states do what Texas did and look really closely at Chinese billionaires tied to the CCP buying property in their states. Texas has passed a law to try and manage this because they had a Chinese billionaire buy 140,000 acres of Texas. Wow. So, and this guy is tied in with the CCP, tied in with the Chinese military. Very, very disturbing. I wanted to tie into the Texas power grid, so they're addressing that. More states should be doing that. I want to see states looking at public universities getting funding from China and Confucius Institutes on campus. This is something that can be done by the state level, by governors. It's an important thing to do. Something that I wish we had done, and I'm afraid it's too late, and I'm afraid that the Biden administration is not serious enough about this to address this. Really, I think the Trump administration should have started the train on this, but would have been a moving of the Olympics from Beijing. This is a huge credibility moment. The CCP is going to win a big credibility gain by having the Olympics there. And the reality is, for a Winter Olympics, who are the countries that win medals at a Winter Olympics? It's Norway, it's the US, it's Canada, it's Sweden, it's Switzerland, it's Germany, all countries that theoretically have a really big problem with what the CCP is doing to Uyghurs, will publicly say that. And I think had the US been proactive on this, could have put together a coalition to say, we're not going to participate unless the Olympics are moved. We haven't done that. We've seen some movement from Congress, but not enough. And then, another one that I think is, this is maybe a little bit hard in the paint, but I think it's worth saying is a conversation needs to be had about economic reparations from China for the impact of COVID. That's a conversation that's not being had, but really should be at our, at the international level. There should be a serious conversation about what was the economic impact of COVID on countries, and does China bear some responsibility for not sharing information early enough, sharing wrong information, and allowing the spread early on. So that's sort of just maybe my quick laundry list for you, and happy to talk more about anything.
Yeah, no, that's a good list. It really is. John, the church has a really good history of being on the front line of a lot of these things. I think back about the human slave trade and William Wilberforce and all of that. Like, there was boycotts there in certain sense with sugar and things like that. Have we, I guess, and this is a question for everybody, have we seen from a consumer standpoint, other than me being able to say with a clear conscience, I'm not participating in this, have we seen boycotts be effective, or is it more of a PR issue? Is it more of a government to government issue? I guess, how do we know that what we're doing is working? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I'm the best one to talk about it. Boycotts are tough. They're tough even when you're talking about something like boycotting Disney, which some folks tried, and
sure, Coca-Cola
was probably not very successful. Boycotting an entire nation, particularly one that is the source of so much exported goods around the world, that there has to be a level of cooperation there. I think it's also, there has to be a level of cooperation there. And as Peter did a great job summing up, and an overwhelming set of facts, which is amazing that he put all that together. I mean, particularly if you look at Hollywood's complicity and the complicity of professional sports to the CCP, it's dreadful. And so they're, of course, dealing with the financial pressures. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic that the tough guy John Cena, for example, did this kind of like, noodle spine, back bend over, thing that we've not seen from the guy, who plays the tough guy in so many movies. I mean, it was just like a script you couldn't have written, as if Xi Jinping wrote the script himself. Like, in other words, it was more effective that he quote unquote failed the party and then apologized. And if nothing had ever happened up front because of the persona of John Cena and the financial levers there. And so the level of co-option of powerful folks in the U.S. and in the West at large is one of the complicating factors here. And I think Peter did a great job summing that up. And it's hard to see how simple boycotts are going to go beyond. But I mean, I do think that in a time when you don't have sort of the cultural power, and this is going to, be the second time I've quoted Alexander Solzhenitsyn already, and we're just 30 some minutes into it. And that is the importance, I think, of people of conscience to, as he put it, not live by lies. In other words, don't be forced to say something that's not true. And, I think Peter's point on the Mulan, kind of thing when Disney kind of, issued these kind of flowering compliments for this just terrible, terrible thing. That's a way of being forced to say something that's not true. Don't participate in lies. That's something that we can all do. Don't participate in lies. I think that that's something that we do in order to keep the truth front and center, even if some of our boycotting doesn't work. And I guess, in other words, you don't boycott necessarily because it'll work. You boycott if it's the right thing to do to not be co-opted into something that's actually wrong. I also think it's important to note that if you look at history and when it has worked and when it hasn't worked, it's never worked by itself. You might say that it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for change. That's especially true in the fight against British slavery. There was an awful lot, and as one of my friends puts it, it's not one thing, it's everything working together there, and along with some divine favor. And of course, that's what we need to pray about, as well.
Yeah, I think it's also hard too, because as a consumer, if I boycott something, I feel like I'm making a difference. But I also don't necessarily, I'm not spurred to do more, right? So I say, okay, I'm not going to buy these jeans, or I'm not going to buy these shoes. And I can feel good about myself, and I can feel good about what I'm doing, but it doesn't cost me anything, right? Instead of buying a pair of Nikes, I buy a pair of Adidas or Adidas, if you want to say it like the Europeans do. But it's a personal responsibility to do more and to go further. To think, to talk, and to have conversations about this stuff. I think it's really good. What do y'all see as, is there anything coming out of the Biden administration outside of these, you talked about those groups that are forming and working together. Is there anything that we can say, hey, you can call your congressman, or you can write your representative? Is there anything that's coming about? I guess, who should we be, two-part question. Is there anything coming down the pipe that we should be looking for? And two, who is thinking and talking well on these things? I know that Pastor Bob Fu's doing a lot of work at China Aid that's really, really good. Who should we be looking to, listening to, encouraging in this fight?
I'm at least happy to jump in and talk, at least from the congressional side. And if you're a constituent, call your congressman or your senator and tell them to endorse the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. There's real teeth to this bill, putting the liability of having tainted Uyghur forced labor goods in your supply chain on the burden of the companies, not on the consumer. A lot of times with consumer boycotts, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It's like you're not getting to the root of it, but to sanction and block goods from coming into our country, it's not an option for consumers to buy it. So that is one that I'm like, please call your congressmen, your senators for the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
That's a Rubio bill, right? That's Marco Rubio is one of the key sponsors of that.
Yes, he is. And then as far as who to follow and who to listen to, I really want to encourage people to try to find Uyghur advocates to listen to, whether it's Nuri Turkle, who is now chair or co-chair of vice chair, I think is his official title, of the of USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or Rushan Abbas, Omar Kanat. There's to listen to the Uyghur voices in this and try to elevate them, I think is really important. And I think as a side note, I was surprised to learn this, that not all Uyghurs are Muslim, that we do have cases of Uyghur Christians and Han Chinese being taken into these camps and into this forced labor system. China Aid even just last week helped rescue a Uyghur Christian family. It was a father and 3 children to get refugee status in Amsterdam. So when we talk about these issues, yes, the vast majority are Muslim and we still support them, but this is also, Christians, our brothers and sisters who we're fighting for in this as well.
That's great. I think to clarify, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but so Uyghurs are what's the right way to say it? You have Han Chinese, which is the majority ethnicity, and then you have Uyghurs, which is a minority ethnicity. But the large portion of Uyghurs are Muslims. Do you know which type? Can you explain which kind of Muslim they are? Are they Sunni? Are they Shiite? Is there a different group that they belong to? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
From my understanding, they're much more of a cultural religious group. They don't really fall into either categories, just from their kind of removal from a lot of like the Middle East politics. But that's kind of my take. I haven't, from just talking to my Uyghur friends.
No, it's good. That's important. That is really important to remember. They do make up a larger group of folks. I also think it was interesting too when you're talking about the surveillance state. Even if somebody is not in a physical prison, the amount of surveillance that goes on in Xinjiang province specifically is just off the charts. And somebody that I was listening to was talking about how they went back to see. They were from the area. They were from that region. They left. They came back. And they were like, all the mosques are empty. Nobody's going. Nobody's practicing their religion. And they said, well, it's because everybody's being watched, because there's people in our homes, there's cameras on the street, and they're monitoring people who go in and out. And I think on the religious freedom front, it's important because there's been a change in rhetoric recently from freedom of religion to freedom of worship, right? And that freedom of worship has been very personal. It's what I do in my own home. It's what I do in my own time, in my closet, if you will. But it's not my ability to practice my religion in public. And I'm not drawing any conclusions or any parallels. I'm just saying that that is an important right to maintain, that right to practice your religion as you see fit. And it's really, really bad. There's no other way to say it.
Yeah. And it all kind of, go ahead, Peter. I've talked too much. I keep jumping in.
Well, no. I'll just add, Brice. I think that it's helpful to sort of be reminded of that, and the fact that, and this is something that my boss Sam Brownback often cites or will say, is that religious freedom is a foundational freedom because it's the freedom to decide what we do with our own soul. And at some level, that is, as Christians, who have a rich and ongoing history and tradition as a faith group of being persecuted to the point of martyrdom. That is something that I think we understand that at a fundamental level, that is not a decision that a sort of a belligerent power can make for you. That is sort of you have the freedom between you and God to sort of rectify your relationship with your Creator. But that sort of, as a belligerent power attempts to oppress you in that way, that is one of those sort of most fundamental things about your identity that they can attempt to control. And what China is doing is really they're trying to erase an identity that they feel is not in alignment with the goals of the CCP. And so it is an attack on a core human right.
That's really good. John, do you have anything you want to add on that?
No, I mean, listen, I'm so grateful, by the way, for Ambassador Brownback and what he's not only done while he was in that position, but what he's done since then, and continues to do to champion some of these causes and to try to find ways to just increase the idea. I'd also say this, that one of the reasons I think it's important too, that as Christians, that we find ways to advance the protections for groups like the Muslim Uyghurs or Nigerian Christians, not just because of human rights abuses, not just because the scale of what they face is genocide. Now, let me be clear. That would be enough to get us to stand up and to do everything we could for their protection. But I also think that one of the things that has to be done here is a rebuilding of the notion of religious freedom, a rebuilding of what it actually means. The culture wars here have redefined religious freedom in such a way that I think for a lot of people, it just sounds like code language for discrimination, typically on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So you have this thing that is so critically important for the long-term health of nation states, the long-term health of societies, communities, and in that case, for peacefulness in world history. And it has been basically hijacked by a very localized Western, you might even say elitist sort of conflict, like the conflict that has taken place in the American context just in the last 30 or 40 years. This kind of falls into the category of what one Oxford researcher is calling luxury beliefs. In other words, that you have to get to a certain place as a culture to have the luxury to believe certain things,
right? And
to diminish religious freedom as a concept to just kind of how it treats sexual behavior is a luxury belief. You don't have that sort of context in most of the world where it's far more earthy and gritty, and you actually have to have the real hard conversations about what makes a nation go forward and the role of freedom of association and freedom of religion. And I know I'm kind of in the clouds right now and away from kind of the on the ground horrific tragedy that we have heard about from Logan I think in great detail already, which is just so helpful. Mm-hmm. But it's going to be hard to do anything long term here unless in the American imagination, and that includes within the church, we get a grasp on what religious freedom actually is and why it actually matters, and how, as Peter quoted Ambassador Brownback, it just actually is. Mm-hmm. What it actually is and the way it serves the larger understanding of religion and for a society.
Sure. Let's take a quick tangent. One of the things that you've been talking a lot about that I think is foundational to these ideas of human dignity, human worth is, you said recently that, I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, that our problem is anthropology. Do you know what I'm going for here? You talk about you quote T.S. Eliot all the time and say that in order to know what something's for, you have to know I'm just totally messing up your whole shtick. Can you just quote T.S. Eliot for me and go down the road? Because it's about who we are as people, right? That's the issue. The issue is who are we and what are we for, right?
Yeah,
and how does that interact with the world? And then the worldview of the Communist Party, which just says we're going to use people as a tool of the state. Like you talked about earlier, these are bad people, and so we're going to get rid of them. How do we reclaim that worldview here, which then allows us to push for that worldview there?
Yeah. Well, you're getting at the heart of what's wrong if you reduce religious freedom down, because that sort of definition of religious freedom, that it's just basically something that serves you and it's just about your own personal preferences, then that reduces religion down and reduces our understanding of the human person down to just, kind of our subjective causes. What Eliot basically argued, and he was talking in this context about education, but before you know what to do with something or what something can do, you need to know what that something is for. And if you see religion and religious freedom just about whether, giving somebody the freedom to do something, as opposed to understanding really who we are. So basically removing religious freedom from an entire, cultural context, as Logan described earlier, that the CCP has done. It's assuming something about human people. It's assuming something about who they belong to, who their actual deepest convictions about life in the world belong to. Whether freedom comes from the state or whether freedom is protected by the state. There could not be a more important distinction in the future of a nation than how it tends to answer that question. Whether people belong to the state or whether the state belongs to the people. These are fundamental questions about anthropology, about what it means to be human. And secularism, of course, flattens humans out. It removes any sort of vertical dynamic, any sort of vertical definition for who we are. And so then we are just who we are in relationship to one another or in relationship to these social entities. And, when those things become absolutized, like the CCP does, and really, I think Logan was right at the beginning too. There's a key moment in this whole story, and that is this kind of Chairman Mao complex that Chairman Xi got at some point, where he really starts to see himself as this never-ending legacy, right. and that the whole future rests on him and what he's doing. I mean, listen, this is a flattening out of the Chinese people, and we see it all over the place. So very, very important.
This has been an excellent conversation. We really appreciate y'all's time. This has just been, it's good to sit and talk and discuss and get a little nuance, especially today in the 24-hour news cycle that we have. Everything's in 30-minute segments or 30-second segments, and to be able to take 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, and sit down and hash a lot of this stuff out is just really helpful. So we really appreciate y'all's time today and look forward to having y'all back in the future. Tony, you want to talk about a little bit what we have coming up next?
Sure. Our next episode is on Hong Kong and the threat to Taiwan and how that is developing, and specifically how China has approached this and been oppressive to those in Hong Kong and what this means for the future. So look forward to seeing you guys then.
It'll be great. I'm Brice Futch.
I'm Tony Melton.
And you've been listening to The Way Forward.